Полагаясь на твои знания и опыт, предоставляем тебе возможность.
The end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a turning point in global geopolitics. From its ruins, 15 independent states emerged, and among them, Ukraine holds particular significance. For centuries, Ukraine played a central role in Russian history and identity. Some even argue that Russian culture itself traces its origins to Ukraine. The first major East Slavic state, Maidan Rus, was centered around Kiev, now Ukraine's capital. Established in the 9th century, Maidan Rus flourished as a powerful medieval state, shaping the language, religion, and governance that would later influence Russia. In 988, Grand Prince Vladimir of Kiev adopted Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium, a decision that laid the religious foundation for what would become Russian civilization. Moscow, which later rose to power in the 14th century, considered itself the rightful heir to Maidan Rus, reinforcing the belief that Ukraine and Russia shared deep historical bonds. But in 1991, Ukraine chose independence, setting the stage for a complex and often tense relationship with Russia. Bound by history yet divided by politics, the two nations have since navigated a fragile balance, shaped by competing interests and shifting global dynamics. When Ukraine declared independence in 1991, it inherited a substantial share of the Soviet military, including the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, surpassed only by the United States and Russia. However, retaining these weapons was never a realistic option for Kiev. Lacking operational control over the warheads, and facing immense diplomatic pressure from both the West and Russia, Ukraine agreed to denuclearization. In 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal, in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. At the time, this agreement was seen as a right step toward regional stability and global nonproliferation. Yet, in hindsight, history would cast serious doubt on the strength of those assurances. As Ukraine navigated its place in the post-Soviet world, a significant shift was unfolding in Europe, NATO's expansion eastward. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined the alliance, marking the first wave of former Eastern Bloc nations integrating into Western security structures. 5 years later, in 2004, NATO welcomed 7 more countries, including the Baltic states, former Soviet republics, that had once been under Moscow's control. This was a pivotal moment in European security, altering the geopolitical balance. But why did these nations seek NATO membership? The answer lies in history. Decades of Soviet dominance had left deep scars across Eastern Europe. Many of these countries viewed Russia as an unpredictable force, and saw NATO as the most reliable safeguard for their sovereignty. For Moscow, however, this expansion was not merely a defensive measure, it was perceived as a deliberate encroachment on what Russia considered its traditional sphere of influence. Ukraine found itself at the crossroads of this shifting geopolitical landscape. While much of Western Ukraine leaned toward European integration and NATO, the east and south of the country remained closely tied to Russia, both culturally and economically. This internal divide would shape Ukraine's political trajectory for decades, making it a key battleground in the broader struggle between Russia and the West. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Ukraine grappled with economic crises, political corruption, and the persistent shadow of Russian influence. President Leonid Kuchma, who led the country from 1994 to 2004, attempted to navigate a delicate balance between Russia and the West. But this was no easy task. As Ukraine sought closer ties with Europe, Moscow, under President Vladimir Putin, worked to keep it within Russia's sphere of influence. Economic pressure, control over gas supplies, and political maneuvering became key tools in Russia's strategy. By 2004, the struggle over Ukraine's future reached a turning point. A pivotal presidential election pitted two sharply contrasting candidates against each other. Viktor Yanukovych, backed by Putin, represented pro-Russian interests and promised stability through close ties with Moscow. Opposing him was Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western reformist, who championed European integration and democratic governance. The election would not only shape Ukraine's path, but also become a flashpoint in the broader geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West. After a high-stakes campaign and intense polling, the day of reckoning finally arrived. The official results declared Viktor Yanukovych the winner, but widespread allegations of fraud immediately cast a shadow over the outcome. Outraged, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians took to the streets, in what became known as the Orange Revolution. The name came from the signature color of Viktor Yushchenko's campaign, which quickly became a symbol of defiance and change. Protesters flooded Kiev's Maidan Square, waving orange flags, donning orange scarves, and covering the city in a sea of vibrant resistance. The movement, defined by peaceful demonstrations and civil disobedience, demanded a fair and transparent election. Under immense domestic and international pressure, Ukraine's Supreme Court annulled the fraudulent results and ordered a revote. This time, Viktor Yushchenko emerged victorious, securing Ukraine's shift toward the West. For Russia, this was more than just a political upset, it was a serious blow to its influence in the region. The Kremlin had invested heavily in ensuring Yanukovych's victory, only to see Ukraine slip further from its grasp. The Orange Revolution deepened the growing divide between Moscow and Kiev, setting the stage for future confrontations that would shape the course of Eastern European history. The Orange Revolution of 2004 was a defining moment, a clear signal of the Ukrainian people's demand for democracy and a future aligned with Europe. Yet, while Viktor Yushchenko's victory was a triumph for the movement, Ukraine's path forward remained fraught with challenges. The following decade would be marked by political instability, economic hardship, and an escalating struggle between Russian influence and Western aspirations. These tensions would eventually reach a breaking point in the 2014 Euromaidan protests, but before that, a series of critical events would reshape Ukraine's trajectory, laying the groundwork for the conflicts to come. After his victory, Viktor Yushchenko set Ukraine on a course toward deeper integration with the West, prioritizing European Union ties and NATO membership. However, his presidency was plagued by internal struggles, economic instability, and fierce resistance from pro-Russian factions within Ukraine. His once close ally, Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, became embroiled in political infighting, further weakening his administration. One of Yushchenko's most ambitious and controversial goals was securing NATO membership for Ukraine. For Moscow, NATO's eastward expansion was already a source of deep resentment, but Yushchenko remained resolute. His efforts gained strong backing from the United States, particularly under President George W. Bush. In April 2008, the NATO Bucharest summit became a pivotal moment. President Bush vocally supported Ukraine and Georgia's bids for NATO membership, emphasizing their right to determine their own security alliances. The summit's final declaration stated that both countries will become members of NATO, though no concrete timeline was provided. For Russia, this was a direct provocation. Moscow viewed NATO's expansion into former Soviet territories as an existential threat. President Vladimir Putin warned that allowing Ukraine and Georgia into the alliance would cross a red line, one that Russia would not tolerate. The stage was set for escalating tensions that would soon have dire consequences. Russia did not wait long to signal its opposition to NATO's expansion. Just months after the Bucharest summit, in August 2008, Moscow launched a military invasion of Georgia. The conflict erupted when tensions between Georgia and its breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, escalated into open warfare. Under President Mikhail Saakashvili, Georgia had been actively pursuing closer ties with NATO and the European Union, a trajectory that alarmed Russia. Citing the need to protect Russian citizens in South Ossetia, Moscow intervened militarily. Within days, Russian forces overwhelmed the Georgian military, advancing deep into the country, before recognizing South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. The war sent a clear and forceful message: Russia was willing to use military force to prevent NATO's encroachment into its traditional sphere of influence. The invasion of Georgia was not just a regional conflict, it was a geopolitical warning, particularly to Ukraine. For Ukraine, the events of 2008 deepened internal divisions. Pro-Western leaders like Viktor Yushchenko remained steadfast in their commitment to NATO integration, while pro-Russian factions increasingly advocated for neutrality, arguing that pushing too hard toward the West risked provoking Moscow's wrath. In 2010, Ukraine's political landscape took a dramatic turn. Pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, secured victory over Yulia Tymoshenko in the presidential election, marking a decisive shift in the country's foreign policy. Unlike his predecessor, Yanukovych sought closer ties with Moscow, pulling Ukraine away from its NATO ambitions. One of his first major moves was signing an agreement to extend Russia's lease on the Sevastopol naval base in Crimea until 2042. This was more than a diplomatic deal, it was a clear signal that Ukraine's geopolitical future was tilting back toward Russia. As Yanukovych consolidated power, corruption became rampant. His administration, riddled with cronyism, stalled Ukraine's path toward European integration. The frustration among Ukrainians grew. Those who had once dreamed of a Western-aligned future now found themselves in a country slipping deeper into Moscow's orbit. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would soon shake Ukraine to its core. Despite his pro-Russian stance, President Viktor Yanukovych initially took steps toward European integration. He pursued an association agreement with the European Union, a deal that promised stronger economic ties, increased trade, and crucial democratic reforms. For many Ukrainians, this was a pathway to a brighter, more prosperous future. But then, at the last moment, everything changed. In November 2013, just days before the agreement was set to be signed, Yanukovych abruptly backed out. Under intense pressure from Moscow, he rejected the EU deal and instead accepted a $15 billion bailout package from Russia, an offer that came with cheaper gas prices and financial aid but at the cost of Ukraine's European aspirations. For millions of Ukrainians, this wasn't just a political decision. It was a betrayal. A future they had envisioned, one tied to Europe, was suddenly ripped away. The response was immediate. Protesters flooded Kiev's Maidan Square, young and old, united by frustration and a demand for change. What began as peaceful demonstrations would soon escalate into a full-scale revolution, one that would shake Ukraine, and the world, to its core. What began as a student-led demonstration, in November 2013, quickly became something much bigger. Young Ukrainians took to Kiev's Maidan Square, demanding that their government honor its promise to sign the EU association agreement. They wanted a future tied to Europe, a future of progress, democracy, and opportunity. But the government had other plans. As riot police cracked down on protesters, the crowds only grew. People from all walks of life joined in, united by a larger cause. What started as a call for European integration became a movement against corruption, government abuse, and, ultimately, President Viktor Yanukovych himself. Then, in January 2014, the situation spiraled. The government passed harsh anti-protest laws, restricting free speech and assembly. Clashes erupted. The streets of Kiev turned into battlegrounds, as demonstrators fought back against police brutality. And then, February 20, 2014. A day that would forever be etched in Ukraine's history. Security forces opened fire on the crowds. Over 100 protesters were killed, in what became known as the Heavenly 100 Massacre. The world watched in horror. Realizing his days were numbered, Yanukovych fled the country on February 22, escaping to Russia. The Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him from office, and an interim government stepped in. For Ukraine's pro-European movement, this was a victory. But for Russia, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would reshape the region and ignite a conflict that continues to this day. For Russia, the fall of Yanukovych wasn't just a political shift, it was a coup, orchestrated by the West to pull Ukraine out of Moscow's orbit. Losing Ukraine to Western influence was simply not an option. And so, Russia acted. Within days, unmarked soldiers, later known as Little Green Men, began appearing across Crimea. They moved swiftly, seizing key infrastructure, airports, military bases, and government buildings. With no insignia on their uniforms, Moscow denied any involvement. But the world knew the truth, these were Russian forces. The Kremlin claimed it was protecting Russian-speaking citizens in Crimea. Then, on March 16, 2014, a controversial referendum was held. The official results showed that over 90% of voters supported joining Russia. But with Russian troops on the ground and no independent monitoring, the West dismissed the vote as illegitimate. 2 days later, on March 18, President Vladimir Putin announced Crimea's annexation. "Crimea has always been Russian," he declared. And with that, the peninsula was absorbed into the Russian Federation. The West responded with sanctions, condemning the move as a blatant violation of international law. But Russia stood firm. Meanwhile, Ukraine, now under a pro-Western government, refused to accept the loss of its territory. Crimea was gone, but this was just the beginning. What followed would be an even deeper conflict, one that would engulf eastern Ukraine and reshape global geopolitics for years to come. While the world's attention remained on Crimea, another crisis was unfolding. In eastern Ukraine, a new conflict erupted, one that would drag the country into years of war. April 2014. Armed pro-Russian separatists stormed government buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk. Backed by Moscow, they declare independence, forming the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Ukraine's government, barely recovering from the turmoil of Euromaidan, launches a military operation to regain control. But this is no ordinary rebellion. By mid-2014, reports of Russian troops and military hardware inside Ukraine begin surfacing. The Kremlin denies involvement, but the evidence tells a different story. Tanks, artillery, and fighters, many with no official insignia, cross the border into Ukraine. Then, in July 2014, tragedy strikes. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 is shot down over separatist-held territory. All 298 people on board, gone. International investigators later confirm, a Russian-made Buk missile, fired from separatist-controlled land, brought down the plane. The world is outraged, but Moscow denies responsibility. Diplomatic efforts follow. Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany negotiate ceasefires, the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015. On paper, they promise peace. On the ground, the fighting never truly stops. For years, the Donbass war grinds on, thousands of lives lost, towns reduced to rubble, and a fragile peace hanging by a thread. But this conflict is far from over. The battle for Ukraine's future has only just begun. As the conflict in Ukraine dragged on, relations between Russia and the West reached new lows. In response to Russia's actions in Crimea and Donbass, the United States and the European Union imposed sweeping sanctions, targeting key sectors of the Russian economy, major banks, and influential figures within President Vladimir Putin's inner circle. These measures aimed to isolate Moscow financially and diplomatically, yet Russia remained defiant, seeking alternative economic partnerships and expanding its influence elsewhere. Meanwhile, NATO responded by reinforcing its eastern flank. Military deployments increased in Poland and the Baltic states, where concerns over Russian aggression ran deep. Large-scale exercises, the deployment of rapid response units, and enhanced defense coordination signaled a clear message: any further expansion of Russian military influence would be met with a firm Western response. Russia, in turn, escalated its military activities. A new wave of defense modernization saw the deployment of advanced weaponry and an increase in military drills, many of which took place near NATO borders. The growing militarization on both sides heightened tensions, raising fears of a broader confrontation. Amidst this geopolitical struggle, Ukraine continued its pivot toward the West. In 2017, it signed the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, deepening economic and political ties with Europe. Military aid from the United States and other NATO members provided Ukraine with essential defense capabilities, including anti-tank missiles and advanced training programs. While Ukraine did not achieve full NATO membership, its growing cooperation with the alliance positioned it as a key strategic partner. For Russia, this deepening Western alignment only reinforced the belief that Ukraine had become a battleground in a larger contest for influence, a contest that was far from over. By late 2021, the crisis reached a critical threshold. Along Ukraine's borders, Russia amassed over 100,000 troops, supported by heavy artillery, armored vehicles, and air power. While Moscow insisted these were routine military exercises, Western intelligence agencies issued stark warnings: an invasion appeared not just possible, but imminent. Diplomatic efforts intensified as world leaders scrambled to prevent war. Talks between Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and European powers were held in a last-ditch attempt to de-escalate tensions. But as negotiations faltered, the Kremlin took decisive action. On February 21, 2022, President Vladimir Putin formally recognized the self-declared independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. In a televised address, he claimed that Russian troops would enter these territories on a peacekeeping mission. The world watched anxiously, but within days, the situation escalated beyond expectation. Then, in the early hours of February 24, 2022, Putin declared the launch of a special military operation in Ukraine. Within moments, Russian missiles and airstrikes targeted military bases, infrastructure, and major cities, including Kyiv. Ground forces pushed into Ukraine from multiple directions, advancing from Belarus in the north, Russia in the east, and Crimea in the south. It was a moment that reshaped modern history, the outbreak of the largest conflict in Europe since World War II. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, which began as a political dispute, has evolved into a full-scale war, reshaping global geopolitics and redefining the balance of power. As Ukraine continues its fight for sovereignty, the world remains on edge, acutely aware that the outcome of this war will leave lasting consequences, not only for the region but for the future of international security. What are your thoughts on this conflict? Share your perspectives in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth analysis. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more content.